our visiting professor, Dr. Hrag Papazian, will give his final lecture as a three-part lecture series. That talk will specifically look at the migrants from Armenia and looking at more of the experiences of the Armenians who've been living in Turkey. So we encourage you to stay connected through Facebook, through our website, to leave your email if you're not on our email list with Professor Emergence to get up-to-date news on events that are upcoming. So this evening's lecture by Dr. Hrag Papazian is entitled Muslim and Alevi Armenians. This presentation is the second in Dr. Papazian's three-part series on Armenians and other Armenians in contemporary Turkey. You may recall a few weeks back, if you were in attendance, Dr. Papazian specifically looked at Armenian Christians who self-identified as Christian Armenians and their perception and their understanding and their experiences living in Turkey, and it was really put together really well. So tonight's lecture is going to give us a different twist. So this evening's talk is devoted to officially Muslim and hence legally non-Armenian citizens of the Republic of Turkey who are drawing on their Armenian ancestors, Islamicized and Alevized generations, earlier identify as Armenians today. Dr. Hrag Papazian is the Kazan visiting professor of Armenian studies at Fresno State. He earned his doctoral degree in anthropology from the University of Oxford in 2020, where his dissertation about Armenians in contemporary Turkey was awarded David Parkins Prize. His thesis also received an honorary mention in the Society for Armenian Studies Distinguished Dissertation Award. So without further ado, I welcome you all to welcome our visiting professor, Dr. Hrag Papazian. Dr. Papazian.
Thank you. Thank you, Argo, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming. Do you hear my voice?
Close, very close. Get closer to the mic.
Closer?
Yes,
Okay.
as possible.
Okay, I'll try to speak a bit louder. Okay, for those who were here last time, about a month ago, I covered, as Hagop said, the Christian Armenian community in contemporary Turkey. So this is a three-part series of lectures devoted to Armenian presence in contemporary Turkey. And when I say Armenian presence in contemporary Turkey, I mean, in my research, I have research and I look at and I examine at least three factions or three sorts, quote unquote, of Armenians and of Armenianness living in Turkey today. These are the officially recognized Armenians, Armenian citizens of the Republic of Turkey. These are Christian Armenians. They belong to the Christian Jemaat, as they would say, as I covered the last time. Then there are the immigrants arriving from the Republic of Armenia since the 1990s, arriving to Istanbul, but also to other Turkish cities. And third, so these are citizens of Armenia, not citizens of Turkey. And third, citizens of Turkey who are not legally considered, officially considered to be Armenian, because they do not belong to the Christian Armenian denomination. Because these are descendants of Islamized Armenians, whom I call Muslim and or Alevi Armenians. So that is what I will be focusing on today. And the point also of this series is to look at the relations between these three groups of Armenians and how do they perceive each other, how do they treat each other, whether they accept each other's Armenianness or not, or whether they question each other's Armenianness. And perhaps I told last time that the Christian, so I focused on the Christian Armenian identity. I tried to explain and understand why Christianity for them has a fundamental place in their understanding and imagination of Armenianness. And I said that that is one of the reasons why they find it quite, the idea of Muslim Armenianness in and of itself, they find to be quite problematic, and they often have issues with accepting that fact or with accepting the very Armenianness of those who claim to be Muslim Armenian or Alevi Armenian. So I talked about my and my wife Nune's project that consists of it's a small 5-page comics, which basically illustrates my research. And you can find it online if you. I'm going to show only one page today, the one related to the Muslim Armenians. I covered the first page and the last page to give the whole picture last time. You can find it if you type on Google illustrating anthropology and then my name. You'll find the full version of it. Next time I will start by looking at the page concerning the migrant Armenians. So basically here is what I'm going to be talking about in more length and detail today here is summed up here. So this guy, Yusuf, who lives in the same Han, if you remember, in the same building where there is also the Christian Armenian woman working, and the migrant Armenian working for the Christian Armenians. So these three people really, this is a real story, they live in the same building in Istanbul. And he says, I'm a Muslim by faith and an Armenian by lineage, by blood. Genetically, I'm Armenian, and that's unchangeable, he says. Just as I took my Y chromosome from my father, and this is a real quotation from an interview I have conducted, I took my Armenian identity from him. But I was born a Muslim. My grandfather was orphaned during the genocide, adopted by a Kurdish family, and Islamized. Back in Batman, historical Sasun for Armenians, when I was younger, I identified as a Kurd, but I was not accepted as such. Turks treated me as a Kurd, and Kurds shamed me for being Armenian. And we see here people from his back calling him Armenian bastard, son of an infidel. You remember last time I spoke about the word gavur and infidel, with which they target the Christian Armenians. Now when it comes to the Muslim Armenians or descendants of Christian Armenians who have Islamized, they're spoken of as gavur oğlu gavur, so son of an infidel. I had two options, he says, either belonging to no group at all, which was becoming increasingly unbearable, or returning to my origins, like a bird that had lost its flock. I chose the latter. I embraced my roots. I am now regaining my Armenianness, as he says. I've been to Armenia twice, and I'm learning the language. I gave my youngest son an Armenian name, but I'm a Muslim, mashallah. So a bit of historical background. Where does this come from? Perhaps many of you know, and I said earlier that, and here we can see about in his story of the genocide, that many of the people who identify today in contemporary Turkey, not just Istanbul, but also Istanbul, as Muslim or Alevi Armenians, many are descendants of Armenians who had under pressure or under threat of getting massacred, who got Islamized, who adopted Islam, who converted to Islam during the genocide of 1915. But that's not all. There are earlier histories and earlier incidents of mass group Islamization, group conversion targeting the Armenians. The oldest one that is remembered by my interlocutors, those within the Muslim Armenians, so a sub-faction within the Muslim Armenians who identify particularly as Hamshen Armenians or Hemshin Armenians, they speak of a history of Islamization that goes back to the 17th century, in the Ottoman Empire, in the historical Armenian princehood of Hamshen, established by Hamam Hashen, established by Hamam Hamaduni, migrating from elsewhere in Armenia. So descendants of that tribe eventually in the 17th and then the 18th century were Islamized. Now a particular characteristic they have, in contrast to most of other Muslim Armenians, is that they have retained the Armenian language. Some of them, part of them, still speaks an archaic version, a dialect of Armenian, the Hamshen Armenian dialect. And then there are mass conversions during the Hamidian massacres in 1896, 1897, and then the genocide. Now, a couple of words about the terminology I'm using here. Who are the Muslim Armenians? What does Muslim Armenian mean? Well, how do I use it myself? Because this topic has been increasingly has come to the fore of discussions in Armenian forums, on even television, in newspapers, in the global Armenian diaspora, in Armenia itself, and there has been quite a lot of talk about Muslim Armenians. But people use different words: Islamized Armenians, hidden Armenians, secret Armenians, crypto Armenians. I have problems with some of these. For instance, Islamized Armenians is not really representative for Yusuf, for instance, who is not himself Islamized, who was born a Muslim. So those who were Islamized at the time, those who were converted, okay, we can use the word Islamized Armenians for them, but it's not really accurate to use the word Islamized Armenians when speaking about the people whom I've been interviewing. When it comes to crypto or secret or hidden Armenians, that's also problematic, also politically speaking, because it's often used by Turkish nationalists to suggest that there are numbers of hidden Armenians, hiding behind Islam, but in reality threatening the Turkish nation, and so on and so on. I can delve deeper into all this later during the Q&A if you like, but I'd just like to say what I mean by Muslim Armenian, because not all descendants of Islamized Armenians can be considered to be Muslim Armenian or Alevi Armenian. I'll come to the Alevi in a second. Many of the descendants of people who got converted to Islam under threat, or perhaps some of them by their choice, do not identify as Armenians. Many of them do not have a clue even that they have Armenian ancestry. So it's also very problematic, sociologically speaking, anthropologically speaking, to call these people as Armenian and to treat them as Armenians, as long as they do not identify themselves as Armenians, right? So even descendants of Islamized Armenians would not do, because that would be a very broad category of people, some of whom do not identify as Armenians. So when I say, to cut it short, when I say Muslim Armenian, I am speaking of people who belong to the Muslim category, to the majority category of the Turkish population, who are either by faith truly religiously Muslim, or only by official denomination. Maybe they're not religious, but nevertheless they are Muslim. But importantly, they do identify as Armenian. They say we are Muslim Armenians. Alevi Armenians is the same logic, only those descendants of Alevized Armenians who say we are Alevi Armenians. And Alevism is a sub-branch within Islam, but it is very much contested in and of itself. Within Turkey, within the Alevi community of Turkey, that is the largest, one of the largest non-ethnic minority. Now we're not talking about the Kurds as the largest ethnic minority. Many of them contest whether Alevism is Islam or not. There are discussions within that as well, and many of, especially the Alevi Armenians, say very clearly that we have nothing to do with Islam, because they come from Dersim, Tunceli, where Alevism is even farther from Islam. So they don't believe in Muhammad, they don't go to the mosque, and so on and so on. So I don't have time to go so deep into what Alevism is in and of itself, but it is considered, so they are legally Muslim as well. So in their identity cards or in the registries, they are legally Muslim, and they are not, again, legally Armenian, because they do not belong to the Armenian denomination or category that I have discussed last time. Okay. So this much for an introduction. Now, what developments did facilitate the public emergence of these Muslim and Alevi Armenians? Because until the 1990s, especially until the 2000s, there was no really talk of Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians. There was no public discussion. There were no people coming out, speaking, giving interviews to Turkish or Turkish Armenian newspapers, or establishing associations and so on and so on. So this is Jamaat in favor of one of the following: Kavim, meaning nation or tribe or people in Turkish; Halk, meaning people; Soy, meaning lineage and ancestry; and Irk, it's the most widely used, meaning, or translatable to race in English. Using the word Irk, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians suggest that Armenians constitute a lineage, and accordingly Armenianness is an inherited, pre-ascribed, primordial, even genetic characteristic, according to some. Muslim and Alevi Armenians argue that they are Armenians because of being genetically Armenian, as some of them put it, because of possessing Armenian veins and blood. Armenianness for them is a matter of öz, a word literally meaning essence in Turkish, a concept they consistently evoke. The Armenian us is imagined to be always and already there, even if its bearer is not aware of it. Unsurprisingly, this essentialist approach considers religion to be irrelevant when it comes to categorizing Armenians. I quote, being a Muslim does not change our irk, our race, I was often told by my informants. One elderly Muslim Armenian from Mush metaphorically explained their situation as follows. We changed our milk, but not our blood. The milk symbolizing nourishment, spiritual in this case. Perhaps also their mothers, some of them would be non-Armenian. And blood referring to the irk. Now, as I did last time, I tried to understand what has led the Christian Armenians to have such a rigidly ethno-religious, even communitarian understanding of Armenianness. Here I'll try to explain what are the different conditions or factors that have contributed to a such us-based or irk-based, race-based, essentialist, primordialist understanding of Armenianness among the Muslim Armenians. So these two different Armenians or Armeniannesses live within the same nation state in Turkey, but they have contrasting, even contradictory understandings and imaginations of Armenian identity. One reason that has contributed to these people's understanding of Armenianness as an irk, as a race, is essentialist and racist discrimination that they have gone throughout their lives. Now, in my previous discussion, I discussed how Christian Armenians are often discriminated against based on their religious difference, and which strengthens or solidifies their understanding of their difference as being religious difference, and hence Armenianness being primarily a religious understanding or a religious category. But in the case of these people, because they did not have the Christian or the non-Muslim, attribute, their discrimination, their othering was based on another, and hence, in fact, racist and essentialist Armenianness that was also perceived to be there from outside. Despite letting go of Christianity and official Armenianness, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians were generally not welcomed into the Turkish nation and its Muslim majority, and were still stigmatized and mistreated as Armenians by descent this time. I first met Asadur in the courtyard of an Armenian church in Istanbul in 2017. A 71-year-old, thin, timid man, raised and classified as a Muslim. Asadur was a resident of Malatya, a city in eastern Turkey, and had come to Istanbul for only a few days. I'm Armenian, he said in a low voice, took a paper out of his pocket, unfolded it, and showed me his hand-drawn family tree as proof. He gave me an appointment and promised to tell his story. A week later, I journeyed for 2 hours to Maltepe, a district in the suburbs of Asian Istanbul, in order to interview him. He was extremely careful not to be overheard. He spoke to me in an extremely low voice, to the extent of causing difficulties when it came to transcribing my interview. However, the one and only quote-unquote controversial and dangerous theme in his whole story was simply his being of Armenian descent and his recent work toward, as he put it and as others put it, regaining Armenianness. This cautiousness was not unique to Asadur and was shared by many of my Muslim or Alevi interlocutors, though to differing degrees. It has one main source, their experience of discrimination and harassment as Ermeni oğlu Ermenis, meaning Armenian son of an Armenian, Ermeni dölü, meaning Armenian sperm, or Ermeni piciz, meaning Armenian bastards, in Turkish. Asadur was born in 1945 in Malatya. He remembers having an Islamic lifestyle during his childhood and growing up according to the Turkish Islamic synthesis, as he says. He knew nothing about his family's past until he was 16, when a friend made fun of him, calling him dönük, a Turkish adjective meaning turned, often used as a label for converts. I felt like I'd been shot in the heart, he told Asadur, and I ran home to my mother asking for explanations. Succumbing to his insistence, the mother advised him to go to his uncle Mehmet, saying that he might know the story. A few days later, the uncle calls him after the Friday Islamic prayer and asks him to promise not to tell what you will hear now to anyone, and that for at least 25 years. And if it weren't for those 25 years, Asadur probably would not have spoken to me. After promising to abide by his uncle's condition, he learned their familial history of Islamization from his uncle. Nevertheless, he continued to self-identify and live as a Turkish Muslim, until a much later stage in his life, when he realized that his Armenian past and the related stigma were inescapable. In fact, he has experienced a whole series of irk-based, race-based, discriminatory acts since that first insult of dönük in high school. When he applied to the military school, for instance, he was rejected for no obvious reason at all, and was told that he had Armenianness in your genes. Still not giving up on his will to be welcomed into Turkishness, he studied Turkish language and literature in Ankara, at least because he couldn't become a Turkish military soldier or a pilot. During his university years, however, he became acquainted with leftist political movements, and we're talking about the 1980s exactly, or 70s that led to the 80s, and eventually joined the Kurdish political movement, which I discussed a while ago. He still did not identify as an Armenian, but rather looked at the world, as he said, through the lens of humanism. So, no particular ethnic identity anymore. He was jailed, so not Turkish anymore, because he's obviously not considered to be Turk, or rejected to be Turk. He was jailed for his political activities in the 1990s, and in 2006, already 61 years old, he suffered a third discriminatory attack. So the first was the dönük at high school, the second one was his rejection at the military exam, and the third one when he was 61 years old, which became a decisive turning point for him. A friend showed him a news piece on a Turkish nationalist media outlet where his name appeared in a blacklist of pro-Kurdish political activists. Unlike everyone else, though, he was ascribed an epithet, Ermeni dölü, Armenian sperm. Faced with this act of public discriminatory shaming and labeling, because that was in a newspaper with his name, he realized that his Armenian heritage was really inescapable, and finally decided, under the pressure of lifelong hateful categorization, to internalize Armenian identity and call himself Asadur, drawing on his great-grandfather's Armenian name, which you can see up there. And is the last generation here I've learned his real name. After that, he started learning a bit Armenian. He started distributing the Armenian newspaper being published in Istanbul, in Malatya at home, for Turks and Kurds to read about Armenians, and so on and so on. Öz-based discrimination was thus a key factor convincing him that he could never fully become a Muslim Turk, and that what counts after all is his essence, his genes, his irk, his genealogy, rather than his religion, political belonging, and even self-identification. He was the grandson of Asadur, whether he wanted it or not. Origin or ancestry-based anti-Armenian discrimination and hate speech is not peculiar to Asadur's case. It is rather a generalized phenomenon in Turkey, and has targeted almost all of my Muslim or Alevi Armenian acquaintances. The state knows it, has been often said to me by my many interlocutors, arguing that the state has information about people of Armenian descent. Apart from Asadur, at least 2 other research participants told me that their applications to the Turkish army had been rejected only because of their Armenian ancestry. And in fact, a couple of them have even learned about their Armenian roots through that process. They had no idea. After being rejected and after doing some pushing for an answer, pushing for an explanation, they were told about it, and then they went back to their families and asked about the story. As shown by historian Taner Akçam, the practice of monitoring Armenian converts had started at least in the late Ottoman period, during the genocide that led to most of these forced conversions. But it continued during the Republican years as well, with secret population censuses counting citizens who were not of the Turkish irk, as it is mentioned in the documents, of which we have now some published archives, and had converted to Islam in the immediate aftermath of 1915. So the state really kept track of these people and was able and kept discriminating against some of them, some of whom applied. That's just one example. There were also other venues of discrimination against them. That's just one example of the applications to military school. So these Armenians live in and are themselves part of what Bonilla Silva, sociologist Bonilla Silva, would call racialized societies, where race is often the master status in interpersonal relations, especially in the absence of religious difference. They are, moreover, constantly otherized on the basis of their both by the state and ordinary Turks, Kurds, Arabs. It is thus not surprising that they perceive Armenianness as a hereditary, as an based as an Öz-based identity, in contrast to the Christian Armenians, who see it rather as a religion, even denominational identity, to the point of some of them, as I covered last time, of even talking about racially non-Armenian people, but converting to Christianity in the Armenian church, for instance, in order to marry an Armenian guy or woman, Hayoldu. You remember? Ermeni oldu, Hayoldu. So he became Armenian or she became Armenian. So a completely different understanding of who and how one becomes Armenian. For them and for these people who understand through racial, racist discrimination that their ancestry is Armenian, and whether they deny it or not, they are faced by that Armenian past. And some of them, of course not all of them, come to a point of accepting that and identifying as Armenians. Why? What motivates them? I'll come to it in a few minutes. But before that, there's also a second factor, less important perhaps factor, but also important, but less perhaps significant if we compare the two, is the Ashiret culture in which many of these Muslim or Alevi Armenians live. Ashirets are tribes, and there's this Ashiret culture, especially in the east of Anatolia, in the eastern parts of Turkey, especially among the Kurdish population. So they are big tribes, big clans, big families, and these are important sociological, categories of social organization in these societies. I don't have much time to go into the details, but these Muslim and Alevi Armenians, most of them, have grown up, especially those who have converted, not just one single individual who was, for instance, an orphan or a woman taken into a Muslim family during the genocide, but those who converted in whole families. They live and they kept living within Kurdish tribes, within Kurdish populated areas, often acquiring some sort of security by the Kurdish tribes. So they would not, security means not killing you in this case, not more, perhaps defending you from other Kurdish tribes that could attack you, in return to free labor on our lands, basically sort of servitude or serfdom. Now, when they lived with these people, in this culture, they also somehow got into that Ashiret structures, and they also got influenced by that Ashiret structure and by that Ashiret culture, by that clan culture, which is very much based on family, very much based on what? Lineage again, and ancestry again. So a culture in which ancestry is fundamental is very much important, and is also something that is very often discussed. Has also impacted, according to my observations, many of the Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians, especially Muslim Armenians who grew up in Mush, in Sasun, and so on. For instance, I'll tell you just one story to illustrate this fact that they pay a lot of importance to that. So there was in the suburb in Istanbul, there was a tea house owned by my Muslim Armenian friend, I would say, and he became a friend. He had a Muslim name, but he also called himself Dikhan, referring to his grandfather, or grandfather's brother, who was called Dikran, and then they changed his name to the Muslim name that he bears now, following him. So he owns that tea shop, and I used to visit. And every time I would go there, it's only men, in a very traditional cultural setting. Oftentimes Kurdish music playing in the background, sitting in low chairs, drinking tea, and most of the people there were part of their tribe, were part of the, I call them Z tribe, I don't want to give the family name, but they call themselves Z Ashiret, so the Z tribe. They're this big, large clan, and so for them, this clan culture, or this idea of the big family, is fundamentally important, and is very much important for their understanding of identity and of Armenianness as well. That's key. I'm bringing back to that. For instance, we sat down together one day, and all cousins came. So second cousins, first cousins. It's a big family, and they have number of children, again, following the culture there. So they came together, and one of them took a piece of paper out, and he started drawing his family tree. When he learned that I'm asking about their Armenian, whether they're Armenian or not, and how come and why, he brought and he drew a whole family tree, just like, again, Asad, which shows, again, that for them, Armenianness and contact with and relationship with Armenianness and with their Armenian identities is through this family history, which is always and already there, thanks to some extent, also the clan system, Ashiret system, which is something that comes up in stories, in discussions, in conversations oftentimes. So you cannot do away with it. You cannot not speak about your family, your ancestry, if you're growing up in that culture, in that Ashiret culture. Because that is really key. And they asked me to draw my tree. And I was, unlike many other Armenians in diaspora, I think I'm lucky because I can go back to 7 generations and give the names. And when I stopped there, they were like, oh, you don't know more, you should go and you should go dig deeper and so on. Because that's what they do. Some of their members, my friend, Vikram, traveled to Armenia later, 2 years later, when I was there writing my thesis, and he got in touch with a branch of their big tribe, Big Ashiret, who had escaped during the genocide to Armenia, who were Christian Armenian citizens of the Republic of Armenia. We went to their home together, they met, they kissed each other, they hugged each other, and he was after that, that important journey or important mission of finding the family. And I tell you another story that I think you would be interested to hear, because it remains interesting to me until the end of my life, because I cannot forget. And this becomes also personal, which also shows this, I don't want to call it an obsession, but it's an almost obsession, in fact, or high interest in finding your family and finding your lineage. And this, again, is not something peculiar to them. It's related to the fact that they live in a society that always keeps asking about your tribe. What Ashiret nedir? What Ashiret do you come from? So that is something really important. It's like, in some other cultures, they might ask about your, your political orientation. Here they ask about your Ashiret first and foremost, because they know you're Muslims anyway. That's not a topic of discussion or question. So I went to Adıyaman. Kahta is a city close to Adıyaman, which is a big city in southeastern Turkey. And I grew up in Beirut, and I had a child friend, still my friend, Khachik. And I had heard from him when I was at the very beginning getting interested in these issues. I told him I'm thinking of doing research about these, and he said, we have a family member, I think. My grandfather's brothers had stayed there and had converted to Islam. And after the 60s, we exchanged letters. But then eventually, when I think my side learned that they converted to Islam, they cut ties and they stopped writing. They stopped communicating, and we have no contact with them. So I can't help you find them, but there's no contact at all. And I eventually went to Adıyaman, and the person who took me to Kahta was a Christian Armenian of Istanbul, and then he took me to a place, to a family to which he was related from his mother's side. And I entered there and I started speaking, and when they learned that I come from Beirut, they said, hey, wait a minute, we have a family branch in Beirut. And of course, I thought about it, but I said, that's impossible. That can't be such a big coincidence. Okay, I said, where were they, and do you know anything about them? And he said, well, my father was in communication with them. We were sending mails, letters, and then it stopped. I don't know why. And then he brought pictures of the letters to me, and that's it. And I started reading, and I could find there the names. And I know from my friend Khachadur, that their family was always Khachadur Mardiros, Khachadur Mardiros. So children, so son, father, son goes Khachadur Mardiros. And I see it's about Mardiros and Khachadurs together. And then they bring me a picture in which I see this picture, which is sent to them from Beirut, in which I see this woman on this one, and I realize that she looks just like my friend Khachik's father. And I say, wait a minute, I have to call them. And I call them, and I do Skype, and I show them this picture, and Khachik's cousin, in fact, he was not available, but I had to call them. So I called his cousin, and she tells me that I have this same exact picture. Where did you find it? And it turns out that This is the same family we're talking about. But the story does not stop here. It turns out that the son of the people I was meeting here in Adıyaman, in Kahta, had traveled 2 or 3 years ago to Beirut, to Burçamut, from Dubai, where he was working back then, in order to find the branch of that other branch of their family, of their Ashiret, which again shows and proves or speaks about this real importance given, this real, passion towards finding your family, your roots, and so on. And that which remains the only root, not root, but R-O-U-T-E, for them to connect with Armenianness. He had gone to Burçamut. He had shown the letters, but no one could find Khachik, although Khachik lives in Burçamut, the same neighborhood where he went, but could not find. So I put them in touch, and they started communicating with him. So thus, lineage and ancestry are extremely important for these people, which further explains why their approach to identity and belonging in general will be centered on these notions. Importantly, the fact that outsiders approach them through the same prism of Ashiret constantly reminds the Muslim and Alevi Armenians of their Armenian past and the inescapability of it, as the Ashiret culture is dominant in those eastern Anatolian regions, and among recent migrants from these regions in Istanbul, asking someone about his Ashiret belonging is very, very common. Ferit, a 25-year-old Muslim Armenian living in Mush, told me during his visit to Istanbul that he previously did not identify as an Armenian. Whenever asked, he used to say that he's an Arab, since his family was Arabic-speaking and lived in an Arab-populated area in Mush. However, the second question would often be about the Ashiret he belonged to, and that would eventually reveal that in reality, as he puts it, I am not an Arab, but an Armenian, because everyone knows that this Ashiret is originally Armenian. After a few such embarrassing experiences, Ferit has decided to answer straightforwardly that he is an Armenian. Consequently, what else could Armenianness mean for Ferit and others like him, if not lineage and ancestry? Okay, I'm going to skip this section because it's taking me too long. I was going to speak about how does their Armenianness manifest itself, how do they practice it, what does it really look like. I'll just give a few examples without reading here. Some of them established Facebook pages like this one, Muslim Armenians, which ceased to exist a year ago, but it was very active, had more than 20,000 likes and followers, and it was established by a Muslim Armenian, also a friend. He made this logo. You can see the symbolism there of the Armenian infinity symbol, but also the Muslim, the crescent, the Mount Ararat, and then on the other side, the Armenians in red. On this side, in green, which is the color of Islam, right? And they remain at this side of the Mount Ararat, right? So that's one instance of practicing. So it's not just telling where Armenians be. They come out publicly, they give interviews, they speak, they go to the television. He has gone up on TV and he's spoken about his ancestry. He has called upon other people. You don't have to, you don't have to be afraid. You have to come out as Armenians. We have to fight assimilation and so on and so on. And yet, learn Armenian language. I started Armenian language courses in Istanbul in order also to find such people and be able to do my research. And 4 of my students two of them were Alevi Armenians, 2 or 3 of them were Muslim Armenians, including Dikran and the owner of this page. And I taught them Armenian. So they would come, they would take the metro for an hour and a half, twice per week, and they would come for no other reason, for no compensation, of course, nothing, just to learn Armenian, just to learn their grandfathers' languages, perhaps to go back to Armenia and be able to speak with their family and so on and so on. And then some of them would come to Armenia, would travel to Armenia like Dikran, or like this other person, this time an Alevi Armenian friend, who came to Armenia and who left back, and I saw on his Facebook, he had written in Armenian, in broken Armenian, not excellent Armenian, as much as he had learned from me, maybe also with the help of some translation software, in Voki Hayastani Patgani. Well, it doesn't, he means to say, but my soul belongs to Armenia, after having visited Armenia. Okay, I skip this part and I come to the reasons and motivations. What drives these people? Like,
especially in a context in a country where it's obviously not the easiest thing to be an Armenian. It's not the most comfortable identity to share, and especially to explicitly declare and express, right? For most of my Muslim and Alevi interlocutors, coming out as Armenian has been quite difficult and brought with it social, psychological, or even financial losses rather than profits. As some within the Christian Armenians would tell me, well, maybe they're doing this in order to, for financial gains, to approach the community, to get for funding and so on. But that wasn't the case for at least most of my interlocutors. How could, in fact, declaring Armenianness be easy in a society where anti-Armenianness is widespread? When Aisha started to express her Armenian identity more openly, giving interviews about it to local media outlets, her employers warned her, arguing that she was putting their organization at risk by portraying a bad image of them with her Armenian public identity and discourse. Ertürk, an Alevi Armenian pop singer, received messages from some of his fans who wrote about their disappointment after he had shared Armenian-related material through his social media account. Peer and family pressure are other serious negative consequences. Some Muslim Alevi Armenians lost friends and even family members, uncles or siblings after coming out as Armenians. I saw a young guy my age literally crying in front of me because he had stopped, or her sister had stopped talking to her after he went to Armenia and revealed his Armenian identity. And he was being, he had no contact with his sister for 5 or 7 years back then. I argue that by choosing the path of Armenian identification and social cultural Armenization, despite the often predictable difficulties, these Muslim and Alevi Armenians present a challenge to theories of political ethnicity, of instrumentalism, and of interest-based identification. In fact, their Armenian identification is even anti-instrumental, anti-interest, anti-self-interest, right? What then if not interest-based strategizing? First of all, these people's Armenian identification consists of a quest for belonging and recognition. The impression of feeling incomplete, as one interlocutor noted, or being imprisoned in a false, distorted, and reduced mode of being, as Charles Taylor would say, is clearly visible among many Muslim or Alevi Armenians. Belonging to nothing is increasingly bothering me. A man from Kayseri wrote to me in an anonymous email after he had learned my name and got my email from an interview I had given to a Turkish Armenian newspaper about my research. He said, Turks think I am a Circassian, while Circassians do not accept me as one of their own. What can one do when no single race treats him as a member? He either returns to his origins like a bird that has lost its flock, or remains permanently in between and becomes miserable like us. Many Muslim and Alevi Armenians' liminal condition and the resulting structural invisibility, as Turner would put it, is thus a subjective psychological factor prompting them to long for hard lines and clear concepts and boundaries, and self-identify as Armenians. In other words, it is a matter of choosing stigmatized but solid belonging over miscategorization and misrecognition that are not, as seen above, really exempt from discrimination anyway. Second, Armenian identification for some consists of a moral political project resisting historical injustice, discrimination, and assimilation. Asked about the most important reasons leading her to the internalization of Armenian identity, Aslihan answered, "They killed my ancestors. They stole an identity from them and me. The Der Garavetian name disappeared, and not in a natural way. That's why I feel I have to change my family name back to it. There is injustice involved, you see. Otherwise, my Armenian past would not really matter to me. If there were no genocide, no forceful assimilation, I would probably be indifferent because I don't really care about nationalities and ethnicities." And also remember Asadur's case, which was also a reaction to forced and constant assimilation and humiliation and discrimination. And I conclude by returning to the Christian Armenians and to the relations between these two groups, right? That's the whole series about. So most of the Christian Armenians, though not all of them, reject, as I said, the Armenianness, even Armenianness of Muslim Armenians. So there's some symbolic rejection saying that, what do you mean Muslim Armenians? Let them decide, are they Muslim or Armenian? They just cannot be both. Then there's also practical rejection, practical boundary making. For instance, some of the associations or organizations of Christian Armenians in Istanbul, for instance, having to do with hometown. So these are hometown associations. So Armenians of Sebastia, Armenians of Sasun, Armenians of Kayseri, and so on. Such organizations have been burgeoning during the last couple of decades in Istanbul. Now they are, organized and managed by Christian Armenians from these areas. Some of these associations, and most of them, do not accept within their ranks Muslim Armenians who come from the same region, because they're Muslim Armenians, and the same explanation, they're Muslim, how can they be understood as Armenian? Some of them do accept, and those who accept Muslim Armenians, Armenianness, belong to that minority within the Christian Armenian community, about which I spoke last time at the very end, when I spoke about the changes in the Turkish political context, which I covered also today in the beginning, which also empowered some Armenians of Istanbul, Christian Armenians, to challenge the state limitations of what Armenianness is, and also the political limits of Armenianness. So challenging the congregational or religious limit of Armenianness, saying that reducing Armenian identity to a religion or to a denomination is in and of itself a sort of pressure and a sort of assimilation. We are more than a religious group. We are a nation. We are an ethnic group, and so on. So these people, because they have a different approach to Armenian identity, because they are more liberal in this sense, they do accept Muslim Armenians as Armenians. They say we should open our arms to them, and we should include them. We should try to. They are gay. They've gone through difficult times, and so on. Whereas the others find it very difficult to accept the Armenianness of Muslim Armenians and of Alevi Armenians because of their own understanding of Armenianness, which is fundamentally based on religion, as I said. So they have this cognitive dissonance. How can a Muslim Armenian be an Armenian? These two words really do not fit together. Some of them really get shocked when they hear them. And finally, there's also deep-rooted mistrust amongst some Christian Armenians towards Muslims because of them being Muslim, because of their own discrimination, because of religion, right? They would say, we've been always discriminated against for being Yahus, Christians. Now we're going to let Muslim Armenians come into our schools and into our communities. What if they treat us as Yahus as well? There's also that issue. And finally, there are some fears that welcoming the Muslim or Alevi Armenians could also jeopardize our relation with the Turkish state. We are already in a very difficult situation. We don't want the state to think that we are doing a political work of collecting the Muslim Armenians and bringing back to Armenianness, or perhaps missionary work of wanting to reconvert them to Christianity. We don't want that headache. So please put that aside. I mean, we might have empathy towards them, but we cannot really accept them into our institutions. Let alone that some of their institutions cannot legally accept, because again of the Turkish setting of what is Armenianness. And I spoke about the Treaty of Lausanne, which gives the right of education to the non-Muslim minorities. But only members of the communities can have access to those schools. So a Muslim Armenian cannot, legally speaking, has also difficulties. Though this has some nuances, I don't have time to get into it, but has some difficulties to get into the Armenian school because he's not also legally Armenian. And I'll end by sharing this slide, just very briefly to speak about their response. So these Muslim and Alevi Armenians come through from a history and past and background of discrimination and rejection and non-recognition, and they finally find themselves and they want to be Armenian, but then they get rejected by the Armenians this time. So how do they respond to that? Of course, they bring back their arguments about Armenianness not being about religion and so on, asking about whether Armenians were not Armenians before they accepted Christianity and such arguments. And I'll end by this quote by a Hamshen Armenian, who is pictured here in Armenia, standing next to the Armenian letter M with which his name starts. He said, Armenianness should be debated and reinvented. He is a teacher of philosophy. It has been restricted to communitarian identity, which is a quite archaic model. It should be modernized and democratized. It should accept religious multiplicity. A Muslim, an Alevi, a Catholic, a Protestant, an atheist, they can all be Armenian. Neither of those denominations make someone Armenian, but all of them can be compatible with Armenianness. Now, many Christian armies in Istanbul definitely do not agree with this. I am aware that many Armenians in the world would probably not agree with this, maybe some of you as well, but that's what he says. And according to me, he is an Armenian because I've seen him as an Armenian.
Thank you.